My name is Emily Parker. I am 32 years old, and I learned the hard way that the most terrifying sound in the world isn't a scream. It's a recorded audio file. I sat in a sterile room, my hands shaking so violently I had to press them flat against my knees as the playback began. Over the static, I heard the trembling voice of an older woman, my parents' neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez. "Please send someone immediately." She choked out to the 911 dispatcher. "There is a child locked inside the metal tool shed in the Parkers' backyard. It is over 106 degrees outside." I can hear her crying. And then, faintly, beneath the heavy Texas wind on the recording, I heard it. The weak, muffled voice of my 6-year-old daughter, Lily, begging for someone to open the door. My memory violently slammed back to that afternoon. I remember throwing my car into park on the blistering asphalt in front of my parents' house. The heat index that day was staggering. The air so thick it burned my lungs, but I didn't feel the heat. I only saw the flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance. I ran across the dead grass, pushing past a paramedic, and then I saw her. Lily was sitting on a yellow stretcher. Her small face flushed a dangerous crimson. Her hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, and her tiny hands were gripping the straps of her backpack so tightly her knuckles were white. I rushed forward to grab my child, but a uniformed officer stepped in my path. I looked up in confusion, and that was when I heard my older brother Daniel speaking to another officer near the porch. His voice was perfectly calm, drenched in the polished concern of a successful family man. "I don't know why Emily left her out there," Daniel sighed, shaking his head. "She's always overwhelmed. She's a single mother, officer. She just loses track of reality." Beside him, his wife, Vanessa, pressed a tissue to her dry eyes. "We thought Lily was with her mother," she whispered. I stopped breathing. My own brother was standing feet away from my nearly dead child, telling the police that I had abandoned her in an oven. The officer looking at me suddenly had a cold, assessing stare. But before the handcuffs could be pulled, Mrs. Alvarez, standing behind the chain-link fence, spoke up. Her voice cut through the heavy, suffocating air. "That is a lie," she said loudly, pointing a trembling finger at my sister-in-law. "That is not what your wife told me 10 minutes ago." The officer turned. Daniel's jaw tightened. And I realized in that split second my brother had not just panicked and lied to save himself. He had been preparing this exact story for weeks. Before I reveal exactly how my brother's meticulously crafted lie began to unravel right there on the dead grass, tell me, where are you watching from today, and what is the weather like outside your window? I want to know how far this story travels. To comprehend how a man could look a law enforcement officer in the eye and frame his own flesh and blood for such a horrific act of negligence, you have to understand the toxic machinery of the Parker household. I grew up in an environment where reality was entirely subjective, constantly rewritten to serve whoever made my parents look best, and that was always Daniel. At 38, 6 years my senior, he was the undisputed golden child. He boasted the corner office, the pristine suburban lawn, and the socially acceptable marriage. Whenever he stumbled, like totaling our father's sedan in college, or quietly being let go from his first corporate firm for cutting ethical corners, my parents swiftly swept the wreckage under the rug. They labeled his failures as the immense pressure of being a firstborn son. Conversely, when I became a single mother at 26, my rank in the family plummeted from a mere afterthought to a permanent disappointment. My father, Richard, viewed my independence not as resilience, but as a walking liability to his country club reputation. Whenever I scrambled to make rent or begged them to watch Lily for an hour so I could pick up an extra clinic shift, he would refuse to even look up from his newspaper. "If you had made better choices, Emily," he would lecture coldly, "you wouldn't be struggling." My mother, Patricia, was the ultimate enabler, sacrificing my sanity to maintain her artificial peace. "Just don't upset your brother," she'd whisper in the kitchen. "You know how he gets." But it was Vanessa, Daniel's wife, who weaponized this dynamic flawlessly. She didn't shout. She utilized a soft, suffocating pity. At Sunday dinners, she would glance at Lily, then back at me, sighing dramatically. "I honestly don't know how you manage it alone, Em." I'd be absolutely terrified if I were Lily. I bit my tongue and swallowed the degradation because I desperately wanted my daughter to have grandparents. I thought Daniel and Vanessa merely enjoyed stepping on me to elevate their own fragile egos. I assumed their cruelty was just an ugly personality flaw. What I couldn't see was that Vanessa wasn't just throwing casual insults. She was carefully gathering them, documenting my every reaction, and constructing a psychological profile that would soon be used to legally tear my child from my arms. People rarely orchestrate the destruction of a blood relative purely out of spite. Emotional malice usually requires a financial catalyst to become truly dangerous. For Daniel, that catalyst was a piece of prime real estate. When our grandmother passed away, she didn't leave her entire estate to the self-proclaimed patriarch of our generation. Instead, she split the equity in her home right down the middle, 50-50 between Daniel and me. My brother was deeply offended by this. He genuinely believed the property was his exclusive birthright, arguing that he possessed a Stipples household, while I had supposedly extracted enough charity from the family over the years. But entitlement was merely the surface of his resentment. Beneath the facade of tailored Italian suits and leased luxury SUVs, Daniel was financially suffocating. He had made a series of catastrophic, highly leveraged market investments and was quietly drowning in concealed debt. To avoid total bankruptcy and maintain his country club illusion, he desperately needed to pull a massive equity loan against our grandmother's estate. However, the mortgage lenders encountered an absolute roadblock. My name was firmly etched onto the deed. The bank required my notarized signature on a quitclaim document, a binding agreement that would effectively sever my legal rights to my own inheritance. Exactly 3 weeks before the brutal summer heatwave brought police cruisers to my parents' lawn, Daniel ambushed me. He shoved a thick stack of legal paperwork across my scuffed kitchen table, aggressively tapping a pen against the signature line. He framed it as a trivial administrative formality. I refused to capitulate. I calmly stated I wouldn't authorize a single page until an independent attorney reviewed the fine print. Daniel erupted. He slammed his fist against the wood so hard my coffee mug rattled, branding me an ungrateful, paranoid burden who was actively sabotaging the family's financial mobility. Through all his shouting, Vanessa remained entirely motionless. Sitting elegantly on my frayed living room sofa, her posture was impeccable, her expression terrifyingly placid. She reached out, placing a single manicured hand on Daniel's wrist, instantly silencing his tantrum. She stared at me with dead, calculating eyes that felt entirely devoid of human empathy. Later that evening, as they stepped onto my porch, falsely assuming my front door had completely latched shut behind them, I heard her whisper the sinister strategy that would alter our lives. "We don't need to force her to sign anything, Daniel," she murmured, her tone smooth as glass. "We just need the courts and the community to stop believing she's mentally capable of making legal or parental decisions." In that chilling fraction of a second, their objective mutated. They no longer wanted just my signature. They wanted complete control. If a family judge could be convinced that I was an unfit, negligent, and psychologically unstable single mother, a conservatorship could be enacted. My legal sovereignty over my finances, my inheritance, and my own daughter could be swiftly transferred to my responsible older brother as my next of kin. To achieve this, Vanessa didn't need to drop a massive, unbelievable lie right away. She only needed to quietly harvest enough twisted, out of context fragments of my daily life, ensuring that when she finally sprang the trap, the illusion of my incompetence would be undeniable. The architecture of their deceit wasn't erected overnight. It was assembled piece by piece, right in my own living room. Following that confrontation over the estate, Vanessa began dropping by my apartment unannounced, hiding behind the guise of a concerned aunt checking in. In reality, she was conducting predatory surveillance. Whenever I turned my back to pour her a glass of water or tend to Lily, out came her smartphone. If I had left 2 unwashed coffee mugs in the sink before rushing to a grueling 12-hour clinic shift, Vanessa snapped a photo, carefully cropping out the rest of my immaculate kitchen to make it look like I lived in hazardous squalor. If Lily's colorful building blocks were scattered across the rug, she framed the shot to scream neglect. She even managed to photograph a final notice electricity bill resting on my entryway table. It was a clerical error, a statement mailed to the wrong address that I had already paid, but the bold red ink looked utterly damning caught on camera. She was curating a digital museum of my supposed failures. Meanwhile, Daniel was weaponizing my digital footprint. He excavated years of text messages between my mother and me. He cherry-picked frantic texts where I begged our parents for emergency babysitting coverage. He meticulously stripped away the dates and the context of my mandatory overtime, creating a false chronological narrative that painted me as a reckless woman, constantly abandoning her child to escape the burdens of motherhood. The social conditioning soon followed. I would later discover a screenshot from a private group chat Vanessa shared with several extended relatives. She had uploaded one of her cropped photos with a caption dripping in synthetic concern. "Single mom chaos. I'm genuinely terrified for Lily. Emily is so dangerously scattered these days. People will easily believe she forgot something critical." They even had the audacity to mock the safety measures I instituted to protect my daughter. As a single parent, I operated on hypervigilance, which included buying Lily a bright pink kid's smartwatch equipped with a GPS tracker and a 2-way emergency SOS button. At one particularly tense Sunday dinner, Daniel pointed at the device and laughed loudly enough for the whole table to hear. "You track your kid like a paranoid lunatic, Em. You need to relax." I stared down at my plate, absorbing the humiliation. I assumed staying silent was the safest way to endure their cruelty. I didn't realize that their mockery of that pink plastic watch would eventually become the greatest miscalculation of my brother's life. Because as the local meteorologists began predicting the first lethal heatwave of the Texas summer, Vanessa finally saw the perfect opportunity to graduate from taking photographs to orchestrating a live crime scene. The day the nightmare began, the National Weather Service had issued a brutal heat warning. By noon, the outside temperature was clawing its way toward 106 degrees. The heat index, the true feeling of the atmosphere when humidity traps the air, was creeping into the danger zone, a suffocating 115 degrees. I had an unavoidable double shift at the medical clinic, followed by a mandatory school district meeting to finalize Lily's enrollment. I had 0 viable alternatives, so I had to ask my parents to watch her for just 3 hours. I was paralyzed by anxiety regarding the extreme weather. At 1:14 p.m., even before I stepped out of my apartment, I sent a highly explicit text message to my mother, Patricia. It read, "Mom, please keep Lily strictly inside the house today. It's far too dangerous to be outdoors. Her purple water bottle is full and tucked inside her backpack. I will be back to pick her up before 4:00 p.m. sharp." My mother replied 2 minutes later, appearing to acknowledge the gravity of my request. "I understand, Emily. Don't worry. The air conditioning is running and she will stay inside." When I arrived at my parents' house, Daniel's luxury SUV was already blocking the driveway. I carried Lily's heavy backpack to the front door. Before she went inside, I knelt down, kissed her forehead, and double-checked the strap of her pink smartwatch to ensure the clasp was tight. "If you need me, you push the SS button immediately, okay?" I reminded her, looking into her bright, trusting eyes. Daniel, standing in the foyer with a glass of iced tea, rolled his eyes with a familiar, biting disdain. "Still obsessively tracking her, Emily? You're suffocating the kid. Just let her live." I refused to engage in his provocation. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my parenting. I stood up, gave Lily one last lingering hug, and walked back out the front door. As I stepped off the porch, I instinctively looked up at the digital doorbell camera mounted by the door frame. The small red light blinked, signaling it was recording my departure. I climbed into my car and drove away, trusting that my daughter was safe in a climate-controlled house with her own grandparents. I believed I had covered every possible angle of safety. I thought I had done everything right. But what I couldn't see was that the moment my car turned the corner, Daniel and Vanessa retreated to the kitchen, and my 6-year-old daughter, sitting quietly in the hallway with her coloring book, was about to overhear the conversation that would change our lives forever. Lily was an observant child. She liked to draw golden suns and tuck herself into the quiet corners of any room she occupied. That afternoon, she was sitting cross-legged in the hallway just outside the kitchen, her crayons scattered across the hardwood floor. Through the open doorway, she could clearly hear Daniel and Vanessa talking in hushed, urgent tones. "She's not going to sign the deed, Vanessa?" Daniel hissed, pacing across the kitchen tiles. "I'm telling you, the bank needs that title cleared by Friday. If Emily refuses, the entire loan falls through." Vanessa's voice answered, calm and venomous. "I told you, if she looks unstable enough, no one is going to take her refusal seriously. Her legal objection won't hold any weight if she has an active child neglect investigation hanging over her head." Vanessa then started listing the evidence she had curated, the photos of the apartment, the cherry-picked text messages. "She left the child here today. We just need to show the authorities that she is cracking under the pressure of single motherhood." Lily was only 6 years old. She didn't understand mortgage loans or quitclaim deeds, but she recognized the malice in her aunt's voice. She understood that these two adults, the people her mother instructed her to trust, were plotting to hurt her mommy. Driven by a child's pure, protective instinct, Lily stood up, clutching her purple water bottle, and stepped into the kitchen doorway. "I'm telling Mommy," she said, her small voice echoing in the silent kitchen. "You're saying mean things about her. I'm going to push my watch button and tell her right now." Daniel froze. The color drained from his face as he stared at his niece. Vanessa immediately crouched down, putting on a sickeningly sweet, fake smile. "Sweetheart, you misunderstood us. We were just talking about a movie we watched." But Lily wasn't fooled. She took a step backward, her hand reaching up to cover the face of her pink smartwatch. Vanessa's eyes snapped to the watch. She realized instantly that the device had an active microphone and GPS tracking. If Lily called me, or if the watch recorded their conversation, their entire setup would collapse. Vanessa stood up slowly. Her fake smile vanished, replaced by a terrifying blank expression. She looked at Daniel and whispered, "She needs to calm down. Put her somewhere quiet. Somewhere the watch can't get a signal." Daniel nodded, his pride turning into pure cruelty. He told Lily they were just going outside to talk about something special. But as they walked toward the back door, Vanessa reached over to the key hook on the wall, her fingers wrapping around the heavy brass key to the backyard tool shed. The tool shed was positioned at the far corner of my parents' backyard, obscured from the main house by a wall of overgrown hedges. It was an antique structure built of corrugated metal roofing and thick, weathered planks. Inside, it smelled of dried, toxic paint fumes, rusted iron lawnmower blades, and decaying grass. There was no air conditioning. There were no windows that opened. On a day when the outside temperature was an unbearable 106 degrees, the interior of that sealed metal box functioned exactly like a solar oven. The temperature inside was easily pushing 112 degrees, the air so stagnant and heavy that it felt as if one were trying to breathe liquid fire. Daniel grabbed Lily by the wrist and dragged her across the brittle, sun-scorched dirt. My daughter started to cry, her small feet stumbling against the uneven ground. "I want to stay inside. I want to call Mommy," as he yanked her forward. Her backpack slipped off her shoulder, and her purple water bottle tumbled out, rolling into the dust just feet from the shed entrance. Daniel didn't stop. He didn't even look back. He shoved my terrified 6-year-old daughter into the suffocating darkness of that shed and sneered. "You don't threaten adults, Lily. You stay in there and learn some respect." Vanessa stood right behind him, holding the brass key like a weapon. Lily pressed her face against the small filthy glass pane in the door, sobbing, "I want Mommy. Please, it's too hot." Vanessa looked at my child, her face entirely devoid of human empathy, and replied, "Then maybe next time you'll remember what not to repeat." The heavy door slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sickening finality. Inside the house, my father, Richard, looked up from his recliner as Daniel and Vanessa walked back into the kitchen. "Where's the girl?" he asked casually. Daniel grabbed a cold bottle of water from the fridge. "She threw a tantrum. I put her in the guest room to lay down. My mother, Patricia, looked slightly concerned. Is she okay?" Emily said to keep her cool. My father waved his hand dismissively. "The child needs discipline, Pat. Emily lets her run wild. Let her cry it out." Back in the shed, Lily pounded her tiny fists against the unyielding wood. The heat was rising by the second. She desperately tried to press the SOS button on her pink smartwatch, but the thick corrugated metal roof and the sheer distance from the house created an impenetrable dead zone. The signal bounced, failing to connect to the cellular network. She was trapped in a furnace, crying until her throat was raw, while her own family sat 50 feet away in a climate-controlled room. But my brother forgot one crucial detail about our neighborhood. The fences were thin, and the neighbors were always watching. Mrs. Rosa Alvarez, a retired pediatric nurse who lived directly adjacent to my parents, was outside attempting to drape a shade cloth over her wilting tomato plants to shield them from the merciless sun. She was wiping the sweat from her brow when she heard a rhythmic, muffled thumping sound emanating from the direction of the Parker property. At first, she assumed a stray animal had become trapped in the brush. But as she crept closer to the shared wooden fence, the rhythmic hitting stopped, replaced by a weak, desperate, raspy voice. "Please, open. I'm so hot." Mrs. Alvarez froze, the shade cloth slipping from her fingers. She peered through a jagged gap in the wooden slats and saw the Parker family's rusted metal tool shed. Sitting in the dirt, directly in front of the heavy locked door, was a bright purple children's water bottle. Mrs. Alvarez recognized it instantly. She had watched me carry that exact bottle up the driveway dozens of times on my way to visit my parents. Alarmed, she didn't just ignore it or second-guess her intuition. She marched straight to my parents' front door and hammered the doorbell. Vanessa opened it, her smile polished and perfectly pleasant, holding a glass of iced lemon water as if she had just finished a relaxing nap. "Can I help you, Rosa?" she asked, her tone light and breezy. Mrs. Alvarez peered past her into the cool, silent hallway. "Where is Lily? I heard a child crying from the direction of your backyard." Vanessa didn't even blink. She answered with terrifying, practiced speed. "Oh, Lily is napping in the guest room. She had a little nightmare earlier, but she's perfectly fine now. Thank you so much for checking, but everything is under control." Mrs. Alvarez offered a tight, polite smile and walked away. But she had been a triage nurse for 30 years. She knew what a child in genuine distress sounded like, and she knew a calculated lie when it was served to her. She retreated to her kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs, and pulled out her tablet, which was synced to a high-definition security camera mounted on her back patio. The camera angle didn't show the shed's entrance, but it had a perfect, panoramic view of the pathway leading to it. She rewound the footage. There, in crystal clear color, she witnessed Daniel dragging a struggling Lily toward the back of the yard, with Vanessa stalking closely behind like a shadow. Most disturbingly, the video showed Daniel and Vanessa walking back toward the main house, completely alone. Lily had not returned with them. Mrs. Alvarez checked the timestamp. It had been nearly 25 minutes of exposure to 106-degree heat. She didn't walk back over to argue with the liars. She picked up her phone, dialed 911, and told the dispatcher that a child was being roasted alive in a metal box. When Officer Hayes pulled his patrol cruiser onto the driveway, his body-worn camera was already capturing the scene. Daniel answered the front door, looking like the absolute picture of suburban innocence, feigning mild confusion. Vanessa stood right behind him, her expression a masterclass in performative anxiety. "Officer, what seems to be the problem?" Daniel asked, his voice steady, projecting the confident authority of a man who believed he was untouchable. Officer Hayes got straight to the point. "We have a credible report of a child locked in your backyard shed." Daniel let out a rehearsed, exasperated sigh, rubbing his temples as if he were dealing with a tiresome inconvenience. "Emily, my sister Emily, dropped Lily off earlier. She left in a massive panic. She's been spiraling lately. I don't know if she forgot where she put the child, or if the girl wandered off. We've been looking everywhere." Vanessa stepped forward, tears welling perfectly in her eyes, adding, "We thought Lily left with Emily. We are so incredibly worried." Officer Hayes narrowed his eyes, his gaze shifting between them. "That's interesting, because your neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, stated you told her 10 minutes ago that the child was sleeping in the guest room." Vanessa's fake tears instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, jagged breath. I was just trying not to alarm the neighborhood until we confirmed where she was," she stammered, her composure beginning to fracture. "Open the shed. Right now," Officer Hayes commanded. Daniel raised his hands defensively, shaking his head. "I don't know where the key is. Emily must have taken it." Vanessa nodded vigorously. "I haven't touched a key all day." But the high-definition lens of the officer's body-worn camera caught the metallic glint of the brass key protruding from the pocket of Vanessa's linen slacks, where she was nervously clenching her fist. Before the officer could escalate the demand, "Mrs. Alvarez shouted from over the wooden fence. "I have video. He took her back there 20 minutes ago." Officer Hayes didn't wait. He unclipped his heavy-duty flashlight, marched to the back, and smashed the padlock off the shed's hasps with a single brutal swing of his baton. When he ripped the heavy door open, a wave of blistering, toxic heat surged out, forcing him to step back. Lily was slumped in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest. Her skin was a terrifying parched red. She was panting rapidly, too exhausted to sob. Officer Hayes scooped her up, rushing her toward the arriving paramedics. As he carried her past Daniel and Vanessa, Lily opened her eyes. She looked at the police officer, and in a weak, breathless voice, delivered the sentence that shattered their entire fabrication. "Uncle Daniel put me in there." Aunt Vanessa had the key. The body-worn camera captured every single syllable, recording the death knell of their deception. I rode in the cramped, bouncing back of the ambulance, desperately holding a cold pack to my daughter's neck as the paramedics monitored her heart rate. At the hospital, Dr. Simmons rushed Lily into emergency care. Her core temperature had reached a staggering 102 degrees. She was suffering from acute heat exhaustion, severe dehydration, and extreme trauma-induced panic. Dr. Simmons pulled me aside, his face grim. and told me flatly that if she had been in that metal box for another 10 minutes, she would have progressed to a fatal heat stroke. My world fractured into a million agonizing pieces. I sat by her hospital bed, gripping her small, ivy-bruised hand, feeling an overwhelming, crushing guilt that I had ever trusted my own flesh and blood. But the nightmare wasn't over. It was merely pivoting. Because Daniel had formally stated to the responding officers that I was the one who abandoned Lily, the hospital's mandatory reporting protocol was instantly triggered. A caseworker from Child Protective Services walked into the room, holding a heavy clipboard and wearing a look of cold professional detachment. Instead of comforting a grieving mother, she began treating me like a prime suspect in a criminal case. "Miss Parker, how often do you leave Lily with relatives because you feel overwhelmed by the demands of single motherhood?" she asked, her pen scratching loudly against the paper. "Were you aware of the extreme weather conditions today? Is there an active custody dispute or a history of family conflict making you act erratically?" I was devastated. I had nearly lost my child, and now the system was looking at me like a potential predator. Vanessa's tactical plan was working with frightening efficiency. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was my father. I answered, praying for him to ask if Lily was alive. Instead, his voice was laced with sharp, biting anger. "Do you see what happens, Emily? You made a massive scene, and now the police are questioning Daniel. You brought this shame onto our family name because you couldn't keep track of your own child. CPS is involved now. I hope you're happy with the mess you've made." He hung up. He didn't ask about his granddaughter once. That night, the hospital room was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the monitors. Lily woke up, her eyes heavy and disoriented. She looked at me, her lower lip trembling, and asked a question that permanently altered my soul. "Mommy, did I do something bad? Is that why Uncle Daniel locked me in the hot room?" I stared at my beautiful, innocent child, realizing that my family had not only almost killed her, but they had taught her to carry the blame for their depravity. I kissed her forehead. "No, baby. Grown-ups are responsible for their own actions, not children." In that exact second, the scared, compliant daughter who had spent her life begging for approval died. I wiped my tears, pulled out my phone, and realized I was done protecting people who tried to destroy my child. I made one phone call to the only person who knew how to turn my grief into an ironclad legal defense. Rachel Kim was not the kind of family lawyer who offered comforting platitudes or soft shoulders. She was cold, tactical, and brutally efficient. When she walked into the sterile hospital cafeteria the next morning, she didn't waste a second on sympathy. She opened a sleek, black legal binder, looked me in the eye, and said, "Don't bother arguing with pathological liars in private, Emily. You make them lie where it can be recorded, and then you leave them no room to breathe." She handed me a pen and gave me 5 unbreakable rules. Never call Daniel to yell. Never post a defense on social media. Communicate only in writing. Preserve every scrap of digital data. And draft a minute-by-minute timeline from the moment I left my apartment to the moment the siren faded. We didn't just have a tragic story. We were assembling a fortress of forensic data. We organized the evidence into an impenetrable, layered timeline that even the most biased investigator couldn't ignore. First, I handed Rachel the text message I sent my mother at 1:14 p.m., explicitly warning her about the heat index and instructing her to keep Lily confined indoors. Second, we extracted the digital timestamp from my doorbell camera, proving mathematically that I had driven away from my apartment 40 minutes before Lily was even moved to that shed. Third, we subpoenaed the high-definition security footage from Mrs. Alvarez's patio, clearly showing Daniel leading Lily toward the back of the yard, with Vanessa stalking behind like a shadow. Fourth, we had the 911 dispatch audio, the proof that an independent, disinterested witness heard a child screaming while the family insisted she was fast. Asleep. Fifth, the absolute goldmine. Officer Hayes's body-worn camera footage. It captured Vanessa contradicting her own alibi, giving two entirely different versions of events within a 10-minute span, followed by Lily's small, breathless voice identifying her captors. Sixth, Dr. Simmons' clinical report, certifying that the acute thermal trauma was a physiological reality and not a result of a child being dramatic. Seventh, the GPS logs from the pink smartwatch. Even though the signal failed to initiate a call, the internal memory card had logged her exact coordinates directly inside that shed at the precise time Daniel claimed she was safe in the guest room. Finally, the eighth piece. A former friend of Vanessa's, who felt sickened by the news, forwarded Rachel a screenshot from Vanessa's group chat where she had written, "Single mom chaos. People will believe she forgot." Rachel scanned the stack of documents, her expression devoid of emotion. She didn't promise me vengeance. She promised me absolute, unvarnished justice. "We're not going to try to ruin them," Rachel explained, her tone sharp as a razor. "We're just going to lay the truth out so clearly that the consequences find them on their own." But Daniel, drunk on his own arrogance and desperate to save his standing in the community, couldn't help himself. Realizing I wasn't responding to his calls, he made the fatal error of taking his lies to the public arena. Daniel posted a long, sanctimonious paragraph on his social media page the next morning. "It breaks my heart to see how some people use their own children for cheap sympathy when they simply cannot handle the responsibilities of motherhood," he wrote, painting himself as the victim of my instability. Vanessa added her own toxic touch, commenting underneath, "Praying for Lily. Children deserve a stable, safe home, not chaos." I saw the notification on my phone and felt my pulse spike with a blinding, white-hot rage. My coworker, Nora, gently reached out and covered my mouse before I could type a single word. "Don't answer him, Emily. Don't give him a shred of drama to use against you. Send it all to Rachel." That post instantly became Exhibit 9, the final, damning proof of ongoing defamation and malicious intent. The climax arrived in a stark, freezing conference room at the district courthouse during a formal civil hearing for a permanent protective order and a CPS review. Daniel strutted into the room wearing a bespoke charcoal suit overflowing with the nauseating confidence of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his entire life. Vanessa sat beside him, dressed in somber, modest beige, playing the role of the concerned, baffled aunt to perfection. My parents sat silently in the back row, fully prepared to watch me lose my daughter. Daniel smirked at the magistrate, adjusting his cufflinks. "Your Honor, there is absolutely no proof I locked anyone anywhere. My sister is delusional and is attempting to frame me to avoid her own negligence charges." Rachel Kim didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply opened a heavy black leather binder. She methodically started laying down the timeline, paper by paper, file by file. She played the doorbell footage, revealing the exact moment I drove away. She showed the text messages. She played Mrs. Alvarez's video, which froze the entire room in a suffocating silence. She presented the medical reports. And then she played the body-worn camera audio of Vanessa spinning two entirely different, contradictory lies within 10 minutes of each other, followed by the faint, heartbreaking voice of Lily identifying her captors. Daniel's face drained of all color, his skin turning a sickly, ghostly gray. Vanessa stared fixedly at the tabletop, her elegant posture entirely collapsing. Rachel pulled out the group chat screenshot, blowing it up on the large courtroom monitor. "Ms. Parker, you stated you believed Emily forgot her child in the heat. Then why did you text your friends saying people will believe she forgot days before the incident?" Vanessa opened her mouth, but the only sound was a jagged, desperate gasp. The silence in the room was deafening. My father, Richard, stood up, attempting to intervene. Your Honor, this is a family misunderstanding. Officer Hayes, who had been subpoenaed to testify, looked at my father with utter, blistering contempt. Sir, sit down. This stopped being a family misunderstanding the second the temperature inside that shed hit 112 degrees. Daniel lost his mind. His carefully crafted mask of the golden sun shattered completely. He turned to me, his eyes wide with a frantic, cornered panic, screaming, "You're really going to destroy your own brother over this, over a minor mistake?" For the first time in my entire life, I didn't cry. I didn't offer an apology to keep the peace. I looked straight into his eyes and said, "No, Daniel. You destroyed yourself when you locked my daughter in that shed and expected me to protect your reputation over her life." The magistrate granted the permanent protective order without a moment's hesitation. The investigation into me was formally dropped, with the state now pivoting entirely to prosecute Daniel and Vanessa for severe child endangerment, filing false police reports, and reckless criminal behavior. The civil claims tied up my grandmother's property in a frozen trust, meaning Daniel couldn't touch a single dime to pay off his debts. His reputation was incinerated. Months later, Lily and I moved into a small, bright apartment near her new school. She started seeing a child therapist. Her teacher, Ms. Carter, told me that Lily had started using yellow crayons to draw the sun again, but this time, in her drawings, I was always standing right beside her, holding her hand. Mrs. Alvarez often drops by with homemade goods, and Lily joyfully calls her Abuela Rosa. My mother tried to call me once, weeping, asking to see Lily. I didn't curse at her. I simply said, "Regret is not a key back into my daughter's life," and hung up the phone. Yesterday, Lily was sitting on the floor coloring. She looked up at me and asked softly, "Mommy, are they still our family?" I knelt down, pulled her into my arms, and held her safe against my chest. "Family is not who shares your blood, baby," I told her. "Family is who opens the door when you're crying for help. This story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. Protect your boundaries, and remember that no amount of shared blood is worth the safety of your child."